Is it okay if we wait 1 more minute, Sam?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I think we can start. I'll do a short introduction and I'll pass you the floor, okay? So, hello everyone, welcome to another talk in our webinar series. Today we have Samuel Schmidt from University of California talking about challenges and opportunities in Rubin Observatory Dark Energy Science collaboration with the team of Photometric Redshifts. Before we start, a quick reminder, this webinar is also being streamed live on YouTube. So you can find the link on our website or you can access it on our YouTube channel, LIneA MCTI. Samuel, thank you very much for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Right, thank you. Let me share my screen here. There we go. Oops. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. So yeah, I'm Sam Schmidt. I am at UC Davis. Davis, if you're familiar with California, is sort of between San Francisco and Sacramento in Northern California. So that's where I'm coming to you from today. I am a project scientist here at UC Davis, and I am also an LSST DESC, Dark Energy Science Collaboration pipeline scientist working on photometric redshifts. So that's what I'll be talking about today, is the Dark Energy Science Collaborations, or DESC's, plan for photometric redshifts, how we're going to calculate them and calibrate them. For a brief outline, I'll give a one-slide introduction to the Rubin Observatory. I'm hoping that since LIneA is a partner in Rubin, you have some background on the telescope and capabilities, and give a brief introduction to photometric redshifts. Most of the talk will be discussion of our plans for calibrating both excuse me, individual galaxy redshifts and ensembles of hundreds of millions of galaxies in tomographic redshift bins that will be used for our cosmology analysis. And at the end, I'll highlight a few areas where I think help is particularly needed in DESC. So if there are any people listening who want to get involved, there are a lot of opportunities in the PhotoZ group. So a quick one slide introduction to the Rubin Observatory. The Rubin Observatory Legacy Survey in Space of Time, or LSST, which is the bulk of the 10-year survey, is going to observe 18 to 20,000 square degrees, so about half of the visible sky over the course of 10 years, with about 1,000 30-second visits distributed in 6 bands, UGRIZY, optical bands. This is a picture of the telescope on Cerro Pachón over in Chile. This is a picture from last month where this crane is lowering the telescope mount assembly, the top of that, the actual superstructure of the telescope, into the dome. So the actual telescope assembly is now complete and getting ready to go. And lower in this building down here, of course, the mirror is sitting down there waiting to be put in the telescope. And the commissioning camera is also in the building being tested right now. So we're getting close. This is exciting to me. I've been working on LSST since 2007. And so I was used to seeing just drawings and renderings of what it would look like. And now there's an actual telescope there. So it's very exciting. And I will say there's actual observations going on. This little dome here, if you can see my cursor in the background, the auxiliary telescope, or Auxtel, is in there. And Craig Lage, who was a postdoc here at Davis, is now in Chile taking observations there with one of the CCDs that of the same type that's going in the camera. So LSST is going to observe something like 37 billion stars and galaxies to great depth, down to almost 27th magnitude in the I band in the course of the 10-year survey. So that's great. This is a tremendous amount of data that we're going to have access to. And it is a nice map of the universe. And unfortunately, it is a 2D map. We're taking 2D images of the sky. What we really want to do is transform that into a 3-dimensional map by adding the dimension of redshift. So LSST is going to take this 1,000 images of each point of the sky. We can stack those up and get a nice image like this. This is a simulated image from within DESC. We generated 5 years of simulated data for about 300 square degrees of the sky. This is a sub portion of that showing a galaxy cluster. And you can see just the richness of the data with even half of the expected LSST depth. But it's not all of the information. You can see a galaxy cluster, but you'd like to know, are particular galaxies members of this cluster? What redshift is this cluster at? And other 3D information. We want to see something like what we have on the right here, where we can see clusters and voids and the filaments of the large scale structure of the universe. So the typical way we do that in astronomy is to go get spectroscopy. We take some sort of disperser, put it in front of our instrument, disperse the light and look for atomic transitions where they're redshifted, and get a redshift for the object. Unfortunately, there are so many objects in LSST and they are so faint that we can't do that. Taking spectroscopy of even a small percentage of the objects would be prohibitively expensive, even on the best spectrographs that we have. So we're going to need some other way of determining our distances for LSST. And that method is going to be photometric redshifts. So the basic idea of PhotoZs is that rather than taking a detailed spectrum where you disperse your light into, say, 1,000 pixels on a CCD and look for individual atomic transitions, we're going to instead look at broadband fluxes. I mentioned the 6 filters of LSST. Here's a graphical representation of the U, G, R, I, Z, and Y band, stretching from about 3,000 angstroms up to about 1,100 or 1,200 angstroms for the tail of the Y band. You can think of this almost as a 6-pixel spectrum of a galaxy. So very broad. Rather than looking for individual transitions, we can look at broad features of a galaxy. So this little movie here is showing an elliptical galaxy SED as it is redshifted through the filters. Elliptical galaxies have this strong break here at 4,000 angstroms due to both an old stellar population where all the blue stars have died and absorption, like the H and K transitions near 4,000 angstroms, that mean that there's a large break in flux between redward of 4,000 and blueward of 4,000 angstroms. And as it redshifts, the position of this break in the G, R, I, Z, Y filters shifts. So you can look at the ratio of the fluxes in those bands to give you some idea of the redshift of galaxies based on their large scale features. One problem with this is you don't get very, very accurate information, as you might expect with only a 6-pixel spectrum. And there are also potential degeneracies. If you see right here, there's actually another break at around 900 angstroms from the Lyman the Lyman absorption of interstellar hydrogen that can sometimes be mistaken for the same break, and you'll get degenerate solutions that you think are one redshift but are actually another. As a cartoon of how we actually use this data, I made a very simplified break where we have a slightly softened break at 4,000 angstroms, and I'm plotting the color versus redshift in the G-R bands and a color plot in R-I versus G-R to show you what happens to the colors as a break moves through filter sets. As the break goes through, you can remember that colors in astronomy, G-R for instance, is the log of the ratio of the fluxes between 2 bands. So as the break goes through, the ratio of fluxes between the bands changes. The color gets redder as the break is passing through, and as it continues to pass through both bands, it goes back down to blue. In a color diagram, the colors actually make a sort of loop, a counterclockwise loop around in color as the break passes through. The break first goes through the blue pair of bands, gets redder, and then back to bluer. And then it goes through the second pair of bands, redder, and back to bluer. And so really what PhotoZ is doing is trying to map the color space in what we have in the LSST is 5 colors, U, G, R, I, Z, Y, in pairs of U, G, G, R, I, etc. And 1 magnitude, since there is some dependence of magnitude on redshift on apparent magnitude as well. We want to map that 6-dimensional space down to the space of redshift. And a way to look at that is to color code a set of galaxies where we have spectra in a color plot. So this is data from, I believe, Z Cosmos in V-R and R-I colors. You can see the low redshift galaxies here are colored blue, and up to the high redshift galaxies being red. You can see, as I mentioned, there's sort of a counterclockwise trend to these data. The blue galaxies are here. You increase in redshift as you spiral around here until you sort of return to similar colors for the high redshift galaxies. So in a region of color space, if all of the galaxies in that region of color have similar redshifts, then you will have a very good idea that other galaxies of that color will also be at that redshift. And you can develop algorithms that give you the probability that a galaxy is at a given redshift as a function of redshift. So a probability density function in terms of redshift. And we call that a PDF or P of Z. So for instance, this region down here that I've circled, most of the galaxies are at redshift near 2. If you were to plot a PDF, it would look like this blue line. There's some scatter. You can see some of them are at 1.9, some of them are at 2.1 or so. So there's a width to the PDF. If you were to take a single number to try and summarize this, it would be probably the mode, the peak value of this PDF, which I've integrated with this red line. So those are the sort of things that we're really looking for. We want a probabilistic description of redshift for each galaxy of our about 3 billion high signal to noise galaxies that we're going to use in DESC. And when you can get areas like this where things are nice and isolated, and the color mapping to redshift is unique, it's great. You get very nice narrow PDFs like this. Unfortunately, there are other areas of parameter space like this where you can see there are objects both at high and low redshift in this color range. And so a PDF for a galaxy like this might look like up here, where there's some probability that it's at low redshift and some other probability that it's at high redshift. And because LSST has such a large sample size in terms of statistics, we really need to understand the systematics of how well we're actually doing at estimating our redshifts to make sure that our systematics do not dominate over the very nice statistics of LSST. So as I said, there's some width, even in the best areas of color space, like down here, there is some width to these PDFs. And if you take the modes, just the peak of the distribution, as I showed in the previous plot, and you plot that estimate, the Z mode versus redshift, you'll see this is for a simulation from way back in the LSST science book, more than 10 years old now. There is some scatter in this relation of about 1 to 5%. That is, if you took Z photo Z minus Z spec Z over 1 plus C, that is about 0.01 to 0.05 that we sort of smear things out. You'll also see some of these catastrophic solutions where we completely miss the redshift estimate, often from mistaking our low resolution spectrum for some other shape that looks similar and has a degenerate solution. The result of this is that rather than a nice map where you can see the clusters and the voids, you get a sort of smoothed out map. You can sort of imagine smoothing this at the 1 or 5% level in redshift. You can still see the overdensities of galaxies and such, but you really don't see the small scale structure anymore. But as I said, with LSST, we will have about 3 to 4 billion galaxies, we think, in our cosmological sample. So statistically, we can still get a very good measure of the overall structure of the universe, even with this fuzzier map. So there are 2 different sorts of redshifts that we have to estimate in the dark energy science collaboration. What I was just talking about was sort of the traditional individual galaxy redshifts. We need those for DESC, but not nearly as much as we need the ensembles that I'll talk about in a second. The individual galaxy redshifts we need for things like supernova host galaxy identification. The LSST is going to take 1,000 images over the course of 10 years, so we'll be able to see transients pop up like supernova going off and then fading away. Again, with 3 billion potential galaxies and hundreds of thousands of supernovae, you're going to have to prioritize which ones to look at. And so having a redshift for the host galaxy may help you in your targeting of the supernova that you care about most. You also need individual redshifts for weak lensing intrinsic alignments. The strong lensing follow-up targeting, there's going to be strong lensing candidates, gravitational lensing candidates in DESC. We'll have to pick which ones to follow up, and a PhotoZ will help us determine which ones will maximize our cosmological return. And of course, something like determining which objects in an image are in a cluster or behind or in front of the cluster will be very important for the cluster science. And for those purposes, something like what I talked about, where we're getting sort of 1 to 5% redshifts, is perfectly fine. We don't need super precise redshifts. We need to understand our distributions very well, but the errors that we get with present day algorithms will work perfectly good for those scientific purposes. The other big component in DESC science is looking at how the universe evolves as we look back in time. And to do that, we really need to break our distributions up in redshift bins. So we have 3 or 4 billion galaxies in our sample. We want to break that into 5 to 10 redshift bins, from redshift around 0 out to redshift 3. We're going to have a few 100 million galaxies per bin. And we need to know the mean redshift and the width of that bin. If you were to sort of approximate them as Gaussians, like these 2 bins down here, we need to know that extremely precisely at the sort of 0.1% level. And just doing something like stacking up the redshifts, the estimates that we have with our 1 to 5% redshifts, is not going to get us to those stringent requirements. So we need some extra methods to calibrate our redshift distributions for these sort of 100 million galaxy ensembles. And that I'll talk about after I go over the individual galaxy redshifts. So I'm going through things a bit fast here. So if you have any questions, feel free to stop me and ask questions. But so for individual galaxy redshifts, there's sort of 2 main techniques to estimate redshifts: template-based methods and machine learning-based methods. Remember that fundamentally what we want to do is learn the relation between our color space, our space of UGRIZY fluxes or magnitudes, and redshift. We do have a lot of knowledge about galaxies. We've been studying them for more than 100 years, so we know what most galaxies, at least in the low redshift universe, look like. And so we can use that knowledge to help us infer a redshift. And as an example, I'm showing here on the left 2 galaxy SEDs, a red galaxy. It's not really an elliptical. You can see it has some emission lines here, so it might be more like an E+A galaxy, but it's very red galaxy with a strong 4,000 angstrom break here. And a blue galaxy, which looks mostly like a power law with a few emission lines. You can see a very small 4,000 angstrom break here, but for the most part, it's just a blue power law. And then with this Lyman break over here at 900 angstroms. We know we have a model of this SED that I'm showing here. We know the UGRIZY filters for LSST, what they will look like. So we can actually compute model colors for these objects and look at where we think these objects would lie in color space. And I should say I'm usually showing just one color plot. Of course, people are bad at picturing things in 5 or 6 dimensions. So for every one of these plots, there is also corresponding plots for G minus R versus U minus G, I minus Z versus G minus R, etc. So I'm showing one slice of our 6-dimensional color space, but it gives you the main idea of what I'm talking about. So if you compute model colors for these 2 galaxies, you can do that between redshift 0 and 2 in spacing of 0.01 in redshift, and that's what each of these dots is. So this is what this red galaxy's colors would be at redshift 0, 0.01, 0.02, etc., all the way out to redshift of 2. You can see, similar to before, this counterclockwise spiral as the break goes through the two filters. And you can see, for instance, that over here, these black points are data from a real survey. These galaxies are probably galaxies that look like this. They're red galaxies here at about redshift 0.8. And they're nice and separated from the other galaxies, so you could probably get a good photo Z for them. This blue SED, on the other hand, starts here and sort of spirals around here and doesn't move very much. And the reason for that is it looks like a power law. And what happens when you redshift a power law, unfortunately, it looks just like a power law. The colors don't change that much. And so it just sort of hangs out here at the blue end of the distribution. And it's much harder to get a good photo Z for these blue galaxies because their colors are fairly similar at each redshift. And unfortunately for us, most galaxies, as you go fainter and to higher redshift, which LSST is probing, tend to be more blue galaxies than red galaxies. So we're going to have some difficulties compared to low redshift surveys in LSST just because of the population of galaxies that we find. So the idea of template-based photo Zs, and it's more complicated than this. I'm giving a cartoon picture because we don't have much time today. Is you take a set of SEDs. This is a set of 4 SEDs from Coleman, Wu, and Weidman. Coleman, Wu, and Weidman, way back in 1980, came up with empirical SEDs that you think sort of span the types of galaxies that you see in the universe. So this is an elliptical red galaxy, 2 spiral galaxies, and a sort of starbursty irregular galaxy blue template. You can compute your model colors for this galaxy. Here's the red, the 2 spirals, and the starburst galaxy. And for every galaxy in your survey, it has a position in color space, like say this black dot here. You compare that galaxy to each of your SED points, compute a chi-squared, taking into account your photometric errors, convert that chi-squared to a likelihood with e to the minus chi-squared over 2, and that can give you your probability as a function of redshift by marginalizing over the different types of galaxies. So you have each galaxy and each redshift, or each type of galaxy and each redshift, sum that up to get a probability distribution. So you would test this galaxy against every single point in this set. So obviously, like it doesn't look like this galaxy. This would have a very high chi-squared and a very low probability. All of them would, except it looks like it could either be this magenta galaxy type at higher redshift, which would be these little bumps here, or more likely it's this green type at a lower redshift, which would be this main peak here. And so you can do this for every galaxy and get a PDF estimate for your individual galaxy. This actually works pretty well. The caveat, though, is that you are making an assumption that all of the galaxies in your survey, everything in LSST, looks like one of your SED templates. Of course, we don't actually use just 4 templates. We'll have something like 100 or 200 different templates that have a wider span of things for LSST, but the idea is still the same. And if you're missing a certain type of galaxy, like say there was galaxies at high redshift have a different dust law or something and have a slightly different spectral slope, then they would actually have a different track. And by not having that galaxy included, you will systematically misestimate your redshifts, and you can induce bias in your samples if you do not have a good template set. So one of the research areas in photometric redshifts is ensuring that we have the best template set available. So the other main method in photometric redshifts is to just throw a machine learning algorithm at your training data. This is that same Z-Cosmos data that I showed before. You basically feed this to your favorite machine learning algorithm and tell it, predict redshift for me. You could feed it into something like a decision tree or a neural net or a conditional density estimator. Give it some tunable parameters like the width for your individual density estimates, and tell it to predict redshift. And once you train your algorithm, you would then feed in your data that you do not have spectroscopy for, and it would use the same machinery to predict a P of Z for each of your 3 billion galaxies. This works very, very well if your training data is representative of the underlying data. If you have any missing data, so imagine if for some reason galaxies of a certain color just don't give you a redshift, if those are missing, then the algorithm will not know to put probability there, and it can, again, bias your redshift estimates. So similar to putting a lot of effort into making sure that your templates are correct in template-based redshifts, the efforts in machine learning-based redshift estimation is to make sure that your training data is as representative as possible and trying to develop methods that are robust to missing data. And so that is a big concern there. And there are, of course, various algorithms that do better or worse with missing data that we are researching. So those are the basic methods of trying to estimate individual galaxy redshifts. Within DESC, we're developing software infrastructure called RAIL. RAIL stands for Redshift Assessment Infrastructure Layers. So Alex Malls, who is the current co-convener, is very into trains. So all of our software names are puns on railroads or trains or locomotives. You can find the software here on GitHub. This is the code base we're developing for testing the individual galaxy redshift estimates. There are 3 main parts to this. We need to generate some mock data with well-defined redshift PDFs. I'll talk about that in a second. We have estimation, which is actually the main part that I'm working on right now, which is a Python-based class structure that wraps PhotoZ codes. So if you work on PhotoZs, you may have heard of codes like BPZ or TPZ that uses decision trees, or Easy, Delight. There are several other PhotoZ codes, and we want to set them up in our software infrastructure so that we can run them at scale on hundreds of millions or billions of galaxies. The third piece that we're working on right now is evaluation that runs a suite of quantitative tests to evaluate how good our codes that we just ran in estimation are doing. So Julia, who's on the line, is actually working on that right now. We have a big simulation that I mentioned before within DESC, where we have this 300 square degrees of mock data out to Redshift 3 that's based on an n-body catalog. The problem with that data is when we created the data, we start with an n-body simulation catalog that forms dark matter halos. Those get assigned redshifts. Those don't really have a very well-defined redshift probability distribution for each galaxy. They're more just single realizations from a simulation. We don't have a whole suite of simulations where we probabilistically assign the galaxies. They just end up as points in a halo. And so we don't want to use the actual original simulation for our data. We want to create mock data with well-defined statistical properties for each individual object rather than only as an ensemble. And to do that, we're using a cool set of software called normalizing flows with a neural spline-based coupling. So I'm not an expert on this. The actual person developing this is John Franklin Crenshaw. He's a grad student at the University of Washington. But it's a very flexible spline-based algorithm that's able to morph itself very flexibly to match the complex data in high dimensions in a way that captures all of the covariance. And so what I'm showing here on this corner plot, the red is showing data from the original DC2. And I should say it's called Cosmo DC2 because it was data challenge 2. There was an earlier data challenge, DC1. So if you're just wondering about the terminology, that's why we call it DC2. The original DC2 data is shown in red with the contours and points. John Franklin trains his normalizing flow on this data, and it is able to produce mock data that matches the complex nature of this data set very, very well. And I should say you can actually make it even more complex. You can include physical parameters like stellar mass, star formation rate, the Sirsic index of the galaxies that have the bimodal properties of red versus blue galaxies and star forming versus passive. And it's able to capture all of that information. I just couldn't find a plot that showed that as well. But it's able to generate this data for us. And even better, it is a bijective transform, and that just means that it's reversible. You can run this code in either direction just as easily. And what that means is that you can use it to generate mock data like we have here. You can also take data that you already have and run it in the opposite direction. And for existing data, you can produce the model's estimate for the statistical probability distribution, the P of Z, for an individual galaxy for us to compare against. And so that's what we actually need. We're going to use this to generate data where we have some sense of a true PDF for each galaxy, rather than just a single realization, a draw that was assigned its redshift. It's a very cool, very flexible code. It's being used in several areas of research right now. And John Franklin is also using it to generate mock supernova data for a time series challenge. This plastic is the supernova group within DESC. So if you need to do any modeling of data, I would say talk to John Franklin about this very cool bit of code. So we have data that we're going to use here. We will now, of course, feed that into our traditional PhotoZ algorithms in our estimation portion of the pipeline. As I said, this is just a wrapping of PhotoZ codes. So this is, if you've used PhotoZ in the past, you may recognize some of these code names. This is similar to something that we did last year. The PhotoZ group within DESC was working on a paper for a few years where we actually took fairly idealized data and fed it into 12 different PhotoZ codes. But well, actually 11 PhotoZ codes, and then this pathological trains code where it actually gives you the same redshift for every single galaxy in the sample. It's not really a real PhotoZ code. But we fed all of the codes idealized data to see whether there were any sort of systematic problems with the codes. And we actually found several in this study. You can look at our paper. Digging into the guts of the codes, there's actually problems with Easy and Lafar in the math of how they marginalize their redshifts. And you can see other things like neural net-based codes like ANZ2 sometimes under-predicted high redshift and over-predicted low redshift, which is fairly typical behavior for a machine learning code. Other systematic degeneracies that pop up. We're able to look at our different codes and then say, which of these codes do we think is actually good enough to meet our goals within the dark energy science collaboration. This is just the point estimate, I should say. This is that mode for each individual galaxy. Those are easier to picture than PDFs. We're also within evaluation looking at more complex statistics. As I said, Julia is working on coding this literally right now. I just saw a GitHub push from Julia, I think this morning. We can do things like look at this measure called the probability integral transform, or PIT value, and the quantile plots for our ensemble of redshifts. The PIT is just the integral of our P of Z from redshift 0 out to the spectroscopic redshift, the true redshift of each galaxy. So otherwise, the CDF evaluated at the spectroscopic redshift. If our PDFs are actual statistical PDFs, if you're getting the correct percentage of error as a function of redshift, that the histogram of the ensemble of PIT values should be uniform. It should be a flat line. So these blue histograms here are the PIT values from our idealized simulation in last year. And you can see that some codes did very well. This code FlexiBoost, that is a conditional density estimate, did very well. Other codes like CMNN and Delight here, you can see this sort of humped behavior. What this humped behavior is telling us is that our photo Z estimates are under evaluating how good they think they are. Their PDFs are too wide. Whereas if you see this behavior where it's sort of U-shaped and you have extra values at 0 and 1, that means that you're overconfident, that your PDFs are too narrow. And if you see any sort of sloshing to one side where there are more values over here than over here, like BPZ, that means that there's an actual redshift bias, that you're actually systematically misestimating some of your redshifts. So again, we're using these as diagnostic tools in order to determine which codes we want to move forward with. So we probably won't use something like Meta4. We can also look at whether there are things we can do to correct these biases. Like CMNN is actually, if you broaden the P of Z's a bit, say just smooth them with a Gaussian, you actually get a very good answer. So CMNN we might use going forward. But these are the sorts of things we're doing. We're working on new metrics and adding them to our code base right now. But we think we have a pretty good handle on things. We think we know which codes we're going to go forward with. We have some good ideas for metrics. So for individual galaxy redshifts, DESC thinks that we're in a good position. We will continue analyzing. We'll probably use something like FlexiBoost. We probably want at least one template code like either BPZ or LaFar. And we will use those to predict our individual galaxy redshifts. As I said, the sort of harder problem is estimating these tomographic bins. We need 0.1 to 0.2% accuracy. This is an excerpt from the DESC science requirements document, which you can find here at this archive address, that lists the actual requirements. You can see that in the 10-year survey, after 10 years, we need to know the mean redshift of each tomographic bin to within 0.001 times 1 plus C. And even at the 1-year redshift distributions, after just 1 year of data taking, in order for systematic errors not to dominate, we need to know our mean redshift to within 0.002 times 1 plus C. These are just very, very stringent requirements. As I said, we're getting 1 to 5% errors on our individual redshifts. When you sort of stack them up, if you took your P of Z's and sort of co-added them, you might get some distribution. The error might be smaller than the 5%. You might get, 0.5% to 1% because of different errors canceling out, but it's nowhere near these tolerances even for year 1. So we need some other ways to calibrate our estimates of the ensemble distributions. There's 2 main candidates for doing this: a method called direct calibration that involves reweighting spectroscopy, and a method that uses spatial cross correlations with a spectroscopic data set. These are going to be in a separate area of the DESC Rail software called Summarizer, because they're summarizing distributions of redshift. And if either what I'm about to talk about sounds interesting to you, we definitely are looking for help with these. There's algorithms that have been developed, but getting them into the DESC infrastructure and deciding the actual final form of them is still definitely a in progress bit of work. So if you want an example of why we have such stringent requirements, why does it matter so much? This is some nice work from a grad student here at UC Davis who I'm working with, Imran Hassan. He looked at cosmological parameter estimates from a small survey that we have at Davis called the Deep Lens survey. It's an old survey. We took the data, well, in fact, it's before I was there in the late 1990s and early 2000s. It's only 20,000 square degrees. It only has 4 photometric bands, so the photo Z's aren't very good. And we didn't have very good data to calibrate it at the time. I did some of the original photo Z calculations back in 2007. So Imran looked at the data. He divided the data up into tomographic bins, by taking the single Z mode estimates between the points in this gray area, so say 0.4 to 0.6, 0.6 to 0.8, and 0.8 to 1, by sort of stacking the individual galaxy redshifts, you get this orange line here. And since we originally calibrated, a survey called the Primus survey took GRISM spectroscopy of one of our fields. And so we actually now have redshifts where we can test our photo-Zs deeper than we originally did in the survey. The histogram of those true redshifts is shown here in blue, and you can see that it's wider than these original contours that we estimated. Our photo-Zs were overconfident. So Imran broadened out the photo-Z estimates and then computed the cosmological parameter estimates for omega m, the matter density, and sigma 8, the power spectrum amplitude. And you can see that the blue is the uncorrected using this orange curve, and then the sort of aqua, sort of sea colored one is when you correct and use this green line instead. And you can see there's a very large shift in the value of omega m and somewhat of a shift in sigma 8. And so you can imagine seeing this statistically significant shift for a small survey like the Deep Lens survey. LSST, we're going to have 20,000 square degrees and 3 billion galaxies. These contours are going to be much smaller. So if we get our redshift distribution wrong, it's going to shift our estimates of these parameters. And we don't want to be having a press conference saying we found dark energy and it's just because our photo-Zs were slightly miscalibrated. So that's the reason for why we need to really understand both the mean of this distribution and the width of this distribution. They both affect our cosmological parameter estimates. So let me see how I'm doing on time. Yeah, running low on time. For direct calibration, I'll speed up a bit here. The main idea is really to reweight your bins, the colors of objects in your bins to match your spectroscopic sample. This is kind of similar to an idea that Marcos Lima had in 2008, where he took the entire training data that he had for a redshift bin and reweighted it. So, if you have something like SDSS data, most of your spectroscopic data might be brighter. This is magnitude versus your probability of observing something. You want it to not look like this, but look like your photometric data. So you basically weight these points higher and downweight these objects. And then when you reconstruct your photometric catalog, the reweighting should give you a redshift distribution that is similar to what you have with given your new weights. I hope that makes sense. This was sort of expanded on in 2015 by Dan Masters. He decided to, rather than do the ensemble distribution, he wanted to break the entire color distribution up into cells and then look at the spectra of galaxies within each cell and then do weighted combinations of that to build up a tomographic bin distribution. Usually this employs something called self-organized maps or sums. Those are just a dimensionality reduction thing that takes our, in this case, 8-dimensional space, because he used UGRI, ZY, JHK as a proxy for Euclid, and map it down to 2 dimensions. And that preserves locality so that points in the high dimensional space that are close together are still close together in this 2D space. And so galaxies of this color have high redshift and all live here. Galaxies of this color all have low redshift and live here. And so this method of reweighting galaxy samples based on spectra is sort of the workhorse for several current surveys like the kilodegree survey and the dark energy survey. They're using this reweighting scheme based on SOMs. DESC is using a slight variation called phenotype redshifts, but it's very similar. And it works very well at doing that. There's a slight caveat that I worry a little bit about is that, again, the LSST, the Rubin Observatory, is going to be going several magnitudes fainter than surveys today like DESC and KIDS. These SOM maps are often made only using the color information, not the magnitude information. And that is really, if you think about it, an implicit assumption that there's no luminosity dependence with your redshift in the sample. And we sort of know that isn't true. There is some dependence on luminosity. So I'm a little nervous about how this will work for LSST. The other thing is we don't have spectra for the entire color space. This is a plot from the master's 2015 paper showing only the cells that are occupied from the Cosmos survey. You can see that only about, I think, 45% of the cells actually have a spectroscopic redshift within them. And the ones that do, this is the cell occupation. Most of the cells, if they do have a redshift, only have one redshift or maybe two redshifts. And so if you have a wrong redshift, you can imagine that that will bias your sample. Every galaxy of those colors, when you reweight, will be assigned the wrong redshift. And if you look at the map, you can see points like this red point that look discrepant from nearby points and scattered throughout the map that are signs that there might be problems. And even having 1 or 2% contamination is enough to bias us beyond the expected limits that we need to reach. So we need to be careful when we do this. We think that this will be a part of our calibration strategy, but we need to be very careful in how we construct these SOM maps and we do this reweighting. The other thing that I think is very cool, almost like black magic, and it's partially because I worked on it, but also I just think it's so nice how it uses the fact that galaxies cluster together is cross-correlation calibration or clustering redshifts or clustering Z. The idea here is we can use the fact that galaxies do live in embedded large-scale structure to determine their redshift distribution. If you have a large spectroscopic survey, something like DESC or Foremost, and you can break it into narrow spectroscopic bins, like I'm sort of doing here, you can look at an unknown sample where you don't know the redshift and use spatial cross correlations to actually determine that redshift. So as an example, say I have some black points that I don't know the redshifts of. I can plot them on the same points as this blue bit here. You can see that the blue and black points are clustered together. They're not random, but they don't seem to be clustered with each other. Whereas if I took some from this red sample here, you'll see that the clusters do seem to overlap with each other. And so there's a good chance that this sample, the black sample, overlaps in redshift with the red points, but not the blue points. They're living in the same large scale structure. And if you were to measure that quantitatively with the W of theta, the spatial cross correlations, you would see no correlation for the blue and a very, very strong signal for the red. So the idea of this technique is you take your large sample, something like DESC or Foremost, you create a bunch of individual bins and you run these cross correlations for each bin. You cross correlate your unknown sample, which might have a redshift distribution like this, with each of these, and use the amplitude of this correlation signal to map out the redshift distribution. This was a technique pioneered by Jeff Newman. His grad student, Dan Matthews, has a nice illustration in this 2010 paper doing exactly what I just said. This is the cross correlation for several redshift bins going from redshift 0.2 out to 1.3 for some simulated deep 2 data. You see this dashed line for a reference point, watching the amplitude go from very low, which corresponds to not much redshift overlap, to very high, around redshifts 0.8 to 0.9, and then back down again. So really, we're tracing out the redshift distribution by looking at this cross-correlation amplitude. The mock data that he was trying to recover was this Gaussian form here, and you can see it does a very good job of uncovering this redshift distribution. So again, all you really need to learn the redshift distribution of a set of objects is a large spectroscopic sample, and they have to physically overlap on the sky so that you can run these cross correlations. And it works very, very well in simulations like this. That's a little simplified because actually what you're measuring is not just the cross correlation spatially, it's the product of the nonlinear galaxy bias, which unfortunately evolves as a function of redshift and depends on the galaxy type. You're measuring the product of that with the overlap in redshift. So you do have to come up with a model for the nonlinear galaxy bias as a function of redshift. That's not super easy, but we think it's doable to the level that we need to reach our goals. So, and it's made easier if you can break your tomographic bin into little smaller sub bins, which you can usually do if you add near infrared data. So combining LSST with something like the Roman Space Telescope or Euclid will be very helpful here. There are a couple other factors like lensing magnification. I'm running short on time, so I'm going to skip that. The other thing to mention, though, is we do need very pure samples. Again, even 1% incorrect redshift, similar to the direct calibration, and we will be biased beyond our very stringent goals. So for both direct calibration and cross-correlation calibration, we need very precise control over our spectroscopic redshifts. We can't do like one-line H alpha detections. We need very secure things with either like an O2 doublet, or sorry, an O3 doublet, or H alpha plus N2, or something where we have a very, very sure redshift. We can't use like GRISM redshifts or anything for this. I will say very, very briefly that you can also use this for discovery. Brice Menard and I were on a paper in 2013. This is the redshift distribution of the first survey, all radio sources. And I used it in 2015 to look at the distribution of the cosmic infrared background sources. Yeah, so you don't even need individual sources. You can just use the Planck maps to determine their redshift distribution for a couple of different bands. So the final calibration for surveys like LSST will probably use both the direct method and the cross-correlation method. This is a plot from the DESC survey. This came out back in 2012. You can look at the paper here, where the empty violin plots are from the direct method. You can see some problems due to their using Cosmos and the large-scale structure imprinted in Cosmos here at around redshift 0.7. But when you add in, so WZ stands for cross-correlation. When you add cross-correlations on top of that, it gets rid of that systematic and you get very nice redshift distribution. So this is what the dark energy survey is doing. We will probably be doing something very similar where we use some mixture of both of the techniques. And we really need to determine exactly how to do that in our software is what we're really working on right now. There are some hybrid methods. Again, I'm running short on time, so I won't say much. Marcus Rao has a paper where he combined photometric information and clustering information to get better constraints. There's a similar method by Sanchez and Bernstein from 2019. Marcus's paper is on the archive. You can look at it at this web address or just search for Marcus Rao to read about this technique. There are, of course, different Photo-Z algorithms that we haven't explored fully yet. So Joanna Pasquet actually working within DESC did some work on the SDSS galaxies and using convolutional neural networks or deep nets to estimate Photo-Zs. And these do actually work better for the Sloan Digital Sky Survey than our traditional UGRI-ZY only methods. Using the actual image data as inputs and the deep net, it can learn things like the inclination effects of a spiral galaxy, and that the fact that the effective SED for a face-on galaxy is a little different from an edge-on galaxy. We don't have a neural net, a convolutional deep net method within DESC right now. So again, if that's interesting to anyone, that is something that we might want to include in our analysis that we are missing right now. Blending is another big effect on everything that I just talked about. So this is showing a plot from Dawson et al. 2016. Will Dawson was at UC Davis for a while working on blending. Of course, ground-based imaging, we have the atmosphere in the way and it smears things together. You'd see a blob like this from the ground, but if you look at Hubble Space Telescope data, you'll see that this big thing that looks like one galaxy is actually two galaxies that have been blended together. Remember that Photo-Zs have photo right in the name. So this big object is going to have weird colors because it's not really the colors of one object, it's the mix of the colors of two objects. That will screw up its position in SOM space. It will screw up its comparison to templates. And so this is a big problem for LSST The main reason being that as we go deeper, more and more objects are blended together for LSST compared to like SDSS or even DESC, because they're just so much more dense on the sky. There are so many more galaxies in our 37 billion object survey that the chances that they're blended is very, very high. There is a dedicated working group within DESC working on blending. There are many, many projects, but there are many, many more projects, especially involving PhotoZ, that still need to be explored. So if this looks like an interesting problem to you, again, I think that's a big opportunity for work within DESC if you're looking for a topic to work on. So I'm getting to the end here. There's a lot to do. I took a couple screenshots from the LSST DESC Rail website. This is our sort of checklist. You'll see I talked about creation, estimation, and evaluation. Those now have checkboxes because we're working on them. There is a whole slew of other projects to work on. One of them here is Railroad, which is to put in some incompleteness models into our statistical model for galaxies and see how the different codes respond. So we would look at something like spectroscopic incompleteness. And that is sort of the next to-do item on our list of things to investigate and get into our code, and figuring out which codes to actually use going forward. You can look at this Rail website. Also, the GitHub issues have a lot of things flagged as good first issue if you're looking for something to work on. So there's much to do, but we have a plan for what we need to do. There's a large team working on this for pipeline scientists who are sort of dedicated within PhotoZ, me, Eric Charles at Slack, and Julia there at LIneA. Creation, I mentioned John Franklin and a few others. We really need help for this degradation. Hi, Julia. And in this summarizer, this doing the direct calibration or the cross correlations, we really need some help. Blending, we have several projects in the works, but as I said, there are several other projects that I think we want to work on that we don't have anyone to lead right now. So I think that's the bulk of what I wanted to say. Photometric redshift estimation for both individual galaxies and ensembles is a very challenging problem. We have plans for doing it. We have an idea of what we want to do. Now we are in the process of actually doing it. And we are looking for people to help us do it. But we think we can meet these stringent requirements on the mean redshift and the width of the tomographic bins, and do the same for individual galaxies for things like supernovae. We're always interested in novel algorithms. Something like deep learning would be nice to have. And if you're a DESC member and interested in participating in any of what I just described, you can contact me, you can talk to Julia, or contact the PhotoZ co-conveners, Alex Malls or Shahab Judaki, to participate. Thank you, that's all I have.
Thank you very much, Samuel, for the very interesting talk. We now have a little time for questions. If you're on YouTube, you can put your question on the comment sections and I will read them to Samuel. If you are with us on Zoom, you can raise your hand and ask your questions. So, Julia.
Hi, Sam. Thank you very much for the talk. I hope that people feel encouraged to engage in the work. I have 3 questions, 2 more science questions and another more technical aspect. About the spectroscopic coverage on some cells, is there any plan to do spectroscopic observations oriented to fill those gaps in those cells that are poor, are doing poor calibration due to the small number of spectroscopic measurements there?
Yeah.
Does it make sense?
Yes, and I thought I had it on the slide, but it looks like I removed it. There is a dedicated survey called the C3R2 survey. C3R2, and it's actually C cubed R squared. It stands for the complete calibration of the color redshift relation, run by Dan Masters, the same person at Caltech who created this SAW map. They actually got, I think it was 40 or 80 nights of Keck time to fill in missing cells on this map for just what you're saying. They did it through a combination of individual PIs and applying for telescope time. And there's a data release. If you search for Masters, I think there's at least 2 data release papers filling this in. As I said though, and as I sort of skipped because I was running out of time, what tends to happen when you look at spectroscopy is you look for your SOM cells and you sort of naturally target brighter objects because you don't need as much telescope integration time to get those SEDs, to get a signal to noise on an emission line to find those galaxies. If you were to try and calibrate this SOM, there's Jeff Newman and I and a bunch of others in 2015 had a paper on what it would take to actually try and calibrate photo-Zs in a way like this SOM. This plot here is showing the fractional success rate of getting a redshift as a function of apparent magnitude if you were to take 100 hours of spectrum. So something like if you had 8-hour nights, just stare at the same objects for 12 nights in a row, you would still only get about 80 at the 25 I of 25 that we're kind of using for our cosmological sample. You'd still only be 80% successful for 8 nights of observing time. And that's also, if you see here, 4 nights on something like GMT. So it's just a tremendous amount of effort to get spectra for these faint objects. And so what most of these spectra are there galaxies down here at 22 or 23, or maybe the faint ones are 24. And so if there are either missing populations, this 80% unfortunately isn't random, it's systematic. There's certain like galaxies that don't have emission lines, you're going to miss those. And so in your SOM, there could be a population that is systematically missing. And when you do your weighting, if you have something that has 0 weight, it's just never going to show up. And so that is a real concern.
Thank you. I'll pass the floor to Basilio, and if I had time, I went back with my other questions.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thanks, Julia. So from a specialist now to a non-specialist, yeah, I was very interested on this clustering Z calibration method, and you showed a slide where you clearly see the basic idea. So you have redshift, yeah, this one. You have redshift slices of galaxies with known redshifts, and then you have galaxies with unknown redshifts, and you measure the two-point correlation function for these. And you clearly see that you have a much larger signal for around 0.8 redshift. So my question is about the right-hand side quantity on the y-axis. So how do you go from there? So what is this quantity, and how do you go from finding out a redshift where the cross correlation is larger to assigning individual redshifts to your galaxies of unknown redshifts?
So yeah, you don't actually get individual galaxy redshifts. You only get the ensemble redshift distribution. And so if you care about your individual redshifts, you can't actually do that. All you can get is you can sort of do that. And actually, so I mentioned here in this slide, Brice Menard. Brice has continued to work on this as a discovery tool. You can do something like if you have enough galaxies to have the signal to noise to do it, you could take every galaxy within like a SOM cell. And the problem is when you cut it up to the point where it's small enough, you sometimes don't have very many galaxies left. It might be thousands or tens of thousands of galaxies. You could cross-correlate those galaxies with your spectroscopic sample and try and determine for a very narrow range. And so if you can get your sample localized enough in color space that they would all have the same redshift, you could sort of do individual galaxy redshifts. But really, you're not measuring individual galaxy redshifts, you're measuring an ensemble of redshifts. Does that make sense? So what I'm really saying is that instead of doing like 3 or 5 or 10 bins, in this map, you would try and do like 1,000 bins where it would be galaxies in this little region and this little region and this little region. And that's almost like an individual galaxy photo Z since they have similar colors, but still not quite.
Right, but this phi of P quantity, what exactly is that?
So there's there's if you look at this Matthews and Newman paper, if you go look it up, there's an equation that relates the clustering amplitude and a couple of other quantities that you have to take into account, the angular diameter distance and a few things. I don't have it handy, and we're running out of time. So I would say if you look in this paper, you'll see an equation that has the relation between phi and the amplitude of the cross correlation.
Okay. Thank you.
I would have a question, if I may. Quick question.
Yep.
Actually, two. You showed in a plot before that we have to know better the average of the redshift distributions. What defines this redshift? It depends on the survey?
You mean for like here, or what? Which
No,
slide are you talking?
no, a little before that. When you were comparing some parameters that you get when you analyzed the survey that you from 90.
Oh yeah. Where'd it go? This one.
No. Actually, I would have a question for that one also, but
Okay.
Here, this is the one. What defines this average? It depends on the redshift.
So I should say there are different ways of choosing tomographic bins. So some people choose them based on colors. So you would take your let me find a color plot. You would take your color plot and just do cuts, like R minus I less than 0.2 and V minus R less than 0 or something. And every galaxy in that bin, you want the redshift distribution of those.
Okay.
That's one way of doing it. The other thing that Imran did here is you see this gray shaded region. He took the mode estimate. So we computed individual galaxy photo Z's. He chose the mode that was between 0.4 and 0.6 here. And he stacked up the individual galaxy estimates for that band to get this orange estimate of the tomographic, the overall distribution.
Okay.
So that's the tricky bit, is how you come. There's multiple ways to come up with a sample that you want to determine the redshift for.
Okay. Wow. Thank you. I think we can have Julia's last question.
Okay.
Before we end.
And sorry for
Yeah.
running a little bit long. I crammed a lot of information into this talk.
There's no problem at all. If it's no problem for you to spend a little bit more minutes, but could you say very briefly a little bit about how to run this evaluation summarizing on Rail on scale? I think it will be running NERSC.
Mhm.
But how are you planning to do that? To do it at scale? What's the big plan?
So the direct method, I think, is pretty simple. You actually create this SOM map only one time, and in fact, one of the problems with a SOM is that it's not deterministic. If you were to create the SOM map a second time, it would have all the same features, but it would be rotated or changed in some weird way. So you only really need to generate this once based on your data. So we would probably do this once. It would be computationally intensive, but then we would have our SOM map. That of course is only true as long as the data doesn't change. We'd have to do this every time there's a data release, but we would do that, and then we would take our spectroscopic sample and populate the SOM once we create it from the photometric data. That is a little computationally intensive, but not that bad. And once the SOM is made, it's very fast to determine which cell is which. So I think that's okay. The cross correlation stuff, you do have to run a bunch of the spatial cross correlations, but there's a lot of code from the weak lensing and LSS groups, like Mike Jarvis's tree core code, that can do fast correlation functions. So again, I think that it's going to be computationally intensive, but I think it's doable in the sort of And again, we will have this for only certain subsets of LSST data, like the overlap with DESC is going to be something like 3,000 to 5,000 square degrees, so not the full 18,000 square degrees. So we will only be doing a subset of the data. It'll be probably hundreds of millions of galaxies in order to do these cross correlations. And again, this is being done right now for surveys like DES and KIDS, and they're not that much smaller than LSST in terms of both redshift coverage and numbers of objects. So it's definitely doable. It will be computationally intensive, but doable.
So if I understood correctly, the one update on the compilation of spectroscopic redshifts for each data release will be necessary.
Yes, I think so.
Before each data release for time for computation.
Yes. And again, hopefully we're going to be adding to this as time goes on with things like that C3R2 survey that I mentioned, and new spectrographs are coming online like PFS and moons and stuff that might become available, and new telescopes hopefully. So hopefully year 10 data we will have more spectroscopic redshifts available. But again, it is a non-trivial problem to assemble those in a way that is careful enough to not bias our systematic requirements. So that is, I think that's skipped over a lot. Is often that's like some grad student or postdoc is their job is to come up with that sample, and it's becoming harder and harder to do that. So we may have to have a dedicated position for that or something.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sam.
Okay, well, so let's wrap this up. This presentation will be available on our website and on LIneA's YouTube channel. For the next week's webinar, we will have Michael Blanton from the University of New York talking about near and far galaxies observed with the Sloan's Digital Sky Survey. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and a special thanks to Samuel. Thank you, Samuel.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay. And everyone, have a great day, stay safe, and I hope to see you all next week. Thank you.